Okay, so where did our family come from, and how do you know this?
Okay, well, on my father's side, our family comes from a small town in Eastern Europe, what today is Lithuania, called Yerburg. And on my mother's side, from the city of Kiev in Russia. And I know this because my grandfather, Papa's father, was an immigrant to this country in 1920 or 1921 from Yerburg. So he told me a lot of the stories. Plus, I was interested in this when I was in college, and I did some research and found some documents about their journey to this country. And on my mom's side, her sister, your Aunt Judy, she also did research and went and visited some of the sites where the family came from.
Okay, and can you tell me a little bit about the journey from Lithuania and from Russia that our family took?
Sure. So my grandfather, when he was 13 years old, he and his four brothers and their mom came from their town, their small town of Yerburg, and it was near Vilnius, Lithuania. They came to this country via ship. They had to journey across land from their small town in Lithuania to Danzig, Poland, and then they took a ship from there to Ellis Island in the United States. They were going to meet his father, who had already set up shop, a general store in northern Minnesota, in Eveleth, Minnesota, on the Iron Range in northern Minnesota. And when they got to Ellis Island, they changed their name from a long Lithuanian name. It was something like Eliashevitz. They shortened it to Ellis because the customs officials there thought it was too long a name, so they shortened it and Americanized it. He and his brothers and his mom were held in a quarantine on Ellis Island for a few weeks because one of the boys, I guess, had something wrong with his eyes. So they held them there for a few weeks, but then they were released into the United States, and they went first to Altoona, Pennsylvania, and then they took a train to Eveleth, Minnesota. And on my mom's side, when her family came, my mom's grandmother, so my great-grandmother and grandfather, they tried to get into the United States, but they could not. The quotas were full, apparently. So they settled in Canada. They couldn't get into the U.S., but they could get into Canada. So they settled in Saskatchewan, which was really way in the wilds of Western Canada. So.
Okay, and then how many generations can you trace back from your parents?
On my mom's side, only a couple generations to the folks that came to this country from Kiev in Russia. On my dad's side, there was a family member who really delved into the history, and he could trace the family back to the 1600s in Lithuania.
And can you recall any names?
The earliest name we have of a family in Lithuania is, the last name is Navidal. That was the farthest back we could trace it.
Okay, so I know that Papa was in the Air Force, but do we have any other veterans in the family?
Papa was in the Air Force. My grandfather, Nana's father, served in World War II in the Pacific. He was a doctor who was on a ship in the Pacific who would care for the wounded soldiers. And Papa, he was in the Air Force. He had deferred his enlistment until after he finished medical school. And when it was time for him to sign up or to do his service, he was stationed with the Air Force in Bermuda for 2 years. And that was in the early 60s, before the Vietnam War really got started. And I know that Nana wanted for him to re-enlist after his 2 years were up because it was such a nice place to serve, but he was really eager to start his medical practice, so he did not sign up again. But had he signed up for another tour, he probably would have been he would have served in the Vietnam War, because it was just about the time when things were getting started there.
Wow. Okay. Can you, or are there any genealogical records, and where are they? Because I know that you mentioned that you studied the history of our family, and I know Aunt Judy did also. So can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so Aunt Judy did go back and study a lot. She went to Saskatchewan and found the old homestead, where she remembers her grandfather talking about wolves that would come at night to, outside of their cabin, and having come from Kiev in Russia, which was a very, it was a city, to the wilds of Saskatchewan was a real change for them. And they eventually did get into the United States. They moved to Detroit, where my grandma was born. So she was the first American citizen here, and there are those citizenship papers or birth certificates. But on my dad's side of the family, there was a person who went back and traced all sorts of documents from before the Holocaust and for the people that survived the Holocaust, and he put together a book called a Yisker book, which is kind of a memorial to the people of Yerburg, Lithuania, which really all of the Jews in that town were killed in the Holocaust, but the ones that survived sent in pictures and their memories, and there's a book that he compiled about the Jewish community in Yerburg. So we have that documentation. And then when I was in college, I went to the Minnesota Historical Society, and they have in their archives there, they have the census records, and I even found the ship's manifest from where my grandfather arrived in the U.S. in the 20s and then moved to Eveleth, where his dad had already set up a general store, and so they lived there, the census records show, for a couple years.
Okay, and are there any other stories about our family that you remember?
Yeah, well, I was going to say that up in northern Minnesota, at the time, it was a real thriving mining area because it was taconite mines, where they got that ingredient taconite as part of steel. So the steel industry was very, very heavily, it was a big industry at that time. So, and they needed the taconite, so they had these huge mines in northern Minnesota. They still do, but it's kind of a dead industry, I guess. So a lot of immigrants, especially immigrants from Scandinavia, went to northern Minnesota to work in the taconite mines. My grandpa told me these stories. There were a lot of people from Finland and Sweden, Norway, a real rough bunch of people. And my grandpa and his family, they were the general storekeepers, but he had to go to school with these miners' kids who were kind of rough and tumble, and apparently he got beat up a lot, and it was a tough place to be. So that, plus his mom did not like the weather there. It was too much like Siberia. So they eventually moved to Detroit, which was a bigger city with more diverse population, and they did better there. They felt more comfortable there. But an interesting fact is that my grandfather, his uncles had started this general store in northern Minnesota. One of his uncles, Sam, went to Duluth to kind of branch out and open a new branch of their store in Duluth. And it became very successful. It was the haberdashery, the fancy haberdashery in Duluth. And your grandma on your dad's side, so completely unrelated to my family, used to shop at that store because she lived in Duluth when she was young.
That is so cool.
So it was just an amazing coincidence that years later, I met your dad and his mother and I guess it would be my great uncle, at some point may have crossed paths because they were in the same place at the same time.
That's really incredible. Well, thank you so much for letting me peer into your family's history. Thank you.
You're welcome, Rachel. It's your family too.